When you returned to the Bulls after playing baseball, there were some new guys on the team, including Luc Longley. And I'm curious, what did you think about Luc at that stage?
I didn't really have any preconceived ideas. I mean, I knew he was on the team. I was anxious to understand who my teammates were. My mindset was to go, try to get back and win. Anytime that, when I left in '93, I left on top in terms of winning. I was coming back in '95, halfway in the season, and still my mentality was about winning. Now, granted, physically I wasn't prepared for winning at that time because I had a baseball body, but it took me a while to understand my teammates, understand their motivations. You had to understand that when I started with the Bulls, it was 5,000 people in the stands. So, it was like playing to an empty arena, and when these guys are coming in, the arena's been sold out for 6 years, so I wanted them to understand, and Luc to understand, as well as Judd Bushler and Steve Kerr and all the guys that were new, where we transformed from, so that you can feel that energy and you can understand what it feels like playing in front of the fans who for years were always believing that we'll wait till next year, we'll wait till next year. Well, we were the team that was on top now. I thought it was very important for them to understand that history and that dynamic about what the Bulls actually experienced and I experienced. So I felt compelled, once I got to know those guys, to kind of push them to understand, okay, we're not in the bottom anymore, we're on top. And when you're on top, everybody's coming at you. So you have to be prepared. You got to be ready to play.
And did you think Luc was ready? Did you think that he had what it took to work with you to win a championship again?
I didn't know. I think I think Luc can answer that a little bit better than I can. I felt the need to push him. I know at that time they hadn't won. A lot of those guys have never won in terms of the world championship or something to that magnitude. And so I knew it was going to take some learning for them to understand that. That's where my role became very vital, to lead and to give them that that knowledge that they need, along with Phil. Obviously, Phil was the leader, but in terms of basketball leadership, when I say I led based on physically. I get out there, first one there, last one to lead, work on my skill set, blah blah blah. Listen to what the coach, try to do whatever the coach is asking. That was the leadership that I wanted everyone to see, and then reinforce it with my voice when I felt the necessary need to do so. So I felt that, no, I don't think Luc had the mentality of what it took to win, but I think he earned that over the years that we played together. And obviously, following our leadership, Phil, myself, Scotty, just so that he can understand what it would take and how his skill set could fit.
And so what sort of skills did he need to develop more? Was it skills or attitude or both?
I think it was both. He had the skill set. 7-footer, pick and pop, shoot, rebound, block shots. Defensively understood exactly what to do, set great screens. But the mindset of being able to do that every single night, do that against teams that were more physical and teams that are less physical. It was a mindset that I felt like Luc had to learn, and I think he did learn. And we all had to learn over the period of our careers. And but when we were going against the teams like New York Knicks, Indiana Pacers, Miami Heat, it's a certain mentality that those teams are being coached at. We had to match that, if not surpass that. And I think that was the growth of what Luc had to learn.
And so Luc was the first Australian in the NBA. What did you think of his Australian-ness?
Laid back. I'd never seen Luc mad, to be honest. And his personality is that he, every day, good day, mate. You feel that warmth coming from him. And, and that's good. It's good to have that mentality, and you feel like, you're very fortunate each and every day. And You wake up, you enjoy your life, you live it by the moment. But there's times when you have to push yourself a little bit, and you want to see that frustration, you want to see a little bit of anger, and Luc did at times. You had to do a little pushing to get that, but his mentality is that he just enjoys being around people. He is that gentle giant. He's always been big. Wherever he was growing up and been around, so it's quite naturally he always wants to feel welcome and wanted to connect with someone. Maybe a smaller person or anybody. That's a great trait to have. Also, that trait has to be adjusted, especially when you're in competition. Because you want that dominance to be shown. You want that intimidation to be shown in competition. It's not a negative thing. It's always a positive thing in terms of how you utilize it. But it took a while for him to get to that.
So he had to toughen up.
You had to show him a little tough love. That's what I call it, tough love. And great. I loved him as a teammate. I think that any day that I felt frustrated and angered, I can look at Luc and know that, what? It's not that hard. It's not that, this is not, life or death. He simplifies things. His whole mentality is to do that. And that's his personality. And it's good to have people around that can do that. When you have people like myself who are somewhat aggressive, we live in every moment, we want to dominate every little moment, and we forget about how simple life is, how simple the moment may be. This is where he was a great teammate and helped me mature as a person.
A sort of balance to your intensity sometimes.
You're absolutely right. Absolutely right.
Okay, and so what did you think were Luc's strengths and what did you think Luc's weaknesses were?
His strength was he could shoot. He was very smart, good passer. Physically, he could use his body very well in terms of rebounding, positioning. His weakness was, I would say, making sure mentality-wise to be aggressive. Have that killer instinct. In that. You want to dominate, and there's times where I had to push him on that, and he received it well. I mean, it wasn't as if, it was a constant resistance or I felt the necessary need to do it every time we played. No, it was, it was a process that, when you win and you learn, you apply that over a period of time, and with Luc, he did. But his strong points, his athleticism. He didn't have the athleticism as most bigs, but he had the smarts. He knew how to position himself well. He knew how to play against someone like a Patrick Ewing, who he knew was far more gifted athletically. But he was able to utilize his strength, which is shooting on the perimeter, post up, using his left, his right hand, his physicality, to at least make himself known. And it was up to us to compliment him. Make him as important as a Patrick Ewing in situations where he could dominate or he can actually, lead us. And we did that. I think Phil did a good job in trying to gauge Luc's motivation that per game. Let's just say we start the game and obviously our focus is to go inside, and we would go into Luc early, and Luc knew that. And if Luc felt compelled or he felt like he was into the game, he can give us that, that lift that we needed from that inside play. If not, then we would have to go to other routes to try to assert ourselves as a team.
Were there times that you were aware that Luc was finding some of your criticisms quite tough?
Yeah, I felt that. I mean, and that's. Look, I think there was a lot of situations where people were somewhat critical in terms of the way that I perceived it, and but I had a mission. I wanted them to understand what it took to win, and winning has a price. And the thing is that I wanted to make sure they were prepared for the worst, especially in competition. And I'm pretty sure there were times they were not happy with me. I think if you look back now, I'm pretty sure they are, based on how we achieved and the successes that we were able to overcome. And but as a leader, you sometimes you're not going to be well liked. You're not going to be, but you have to pull them along, because you've experienced it, you understood it. The other side of that road is success, and I think that the gratification would be there once we get over that hill. And I felt that, and I can sense some of that coming from my teammates. But the thing is that for us to be successful, someone had to do that. Especially from a leadership role.
Did you sometimes wish that you didn't have to be like that?
Yes. Only because I felt like everybody. You would assume that everybody had the same mentality as I had, and that every day you're the first one in the gym, last one to leave. You live within the moment. You strive for perfection each and every time you step on the basketball court. But unfortunately, everybody don't have that same mentality. And if they did, then it makes my job so much easier. It's like looking at a mirror of 11 or 12 people. And unfortunately, the world is not made that way. And sometimes you have to push, pull, or do whatever you need to get over that hill. And the gratification is always going to be in the work. And once the work is done, and you see where the achievement has been met. So yeah, I wish I could have laid back and enjoyed it as much as everybody else, but that doesn't guarantee us success. That doesn't say we're going to win. So I had to do what I had to do.
Over the years, that you played together, did your opinion of Luc change? Did you enjoy playing together by the end of those years and come to really value what he gave to the team?
I did. I valued it, and I also understood how to get it out of him. How to challenge him. As a teammate. And the thing is, and I think Luc understood. He understood that if he missed that box out, then he's going to hear obviously some verbal words coming from me. The expectations were totally different. Once he proves that he could do it, the task is to do it every single night. That's the thing, and that's where I felt like I knew he was capable. We all felt he was capable, but you have to be capable every single night for us to maintain the success. So I pushed him. Obviously, I did, and verbally, I would challenge him in certain situations where I felt like, look, you're not doing what we expect you to do. And I would welcome that too. For my, if they see that I was doing something that they pretty much expected, and I was taking shortcuts, which wasn't too often, I'm pretty sure that I was open. Phil would criticize me. Other teammates would criticize me. And the purpose of improving, and the purpose of being a good teammate, and the purpose of being a good team is we all have to look in the mirror and understand, okay, what can I do better to make this team better? And we also have to be willing to accept constructive criticism. Nothing personally. We hung out, we had fun, we would joke around, it's nothing personal. But in competition, when you're trying to, exceed and be successful, we have to hold each other accountable. That's what teammates do. And it's nothing really personal about it.
Yes, Luc admits that consistency was his big issue and that he struggled with it, and you struggled with the fact that he wasn't consistent enough.
Yeah, it was times like that. And I'll give you a good example. He may not like this story. In '98, we were playing the Utah Jazz. Did he ever tell you this?
I'm not sure which story this one's going to be.
In Utah Jazz, Scottie Pippen was out, and we knew we just played Utah in the finals the year before. So every game we play against Utah is a message. You want to send a message. So I go to Luc at the beginning of the game. I say, look, you have to establish yourself inside. You have to dominate. We're going to come to you early. You're really going to have to set the tone for us, because we don't have Scottie. It's me and Dennis and you. So he understood that. He knew the importance of that. The first quarter ends. Luc has 12 points, 4 blocks, and 4 rebounds. And I go to Luc, I say, that's how you play, man. You do that, we dominate. We up by 16. We're up by 16. We're killing them in their building. At the end of the game, Luc had 12 points, 4 rebounds, and 4 blocks. It's like he sufficed the anticipation or what we wanted him to do in the first quarter, but he forgot it was 3 other quarters. We're winning by 16, we lose by 15. So now my frustration is like, it's boiling, and I go into the locker room and I'm sitting down. I'm just trying to figure out, how did we lose this game? We seemed like we had a good rhythm the first quarter, blah blah blah, and Luc's sitting across from me, and once again Luc has this demeanor that he doesn't really show. Like I'm like boiling over here, but I'm really trying to hold it in because it's just one game. But I understood the significance of the game because we're playing against Utah. You want to make sure that we send a message. And Luc says, "It's okay, mate. It's okay." And the way that he said it made it seem like he didn't really receive it the way that I was receiving it. And I just chuckled and I just looked at Luc and I said, "You know what, Luc? That is the last time I'm gonna give you a compliment in the middle of the game. Because you don't receive compliments well, in the sense that you feel like you stop and you don't really pursue." And I said it, from a, chuckling because I was really frustrated as opposed to yelling. I wanted him to understand, look, man, you don't have to just, you have to keep playing. You don't play just for one quarter just so that now I can look at you and say, you're doing a great job, blah, blah, blah. And I get it, but we still have to play the other three quarters of the game. And it told me more about Luc in the sense that, you got to keep pushing him. You got to keep pushing him. You got to keep pushing him. You can't let him get comfortable, because he gets comfortable, then he relaxes, and we need him to keep being aggressive, and from that point on, I didn't do it in a way, I don't think I did it in a way to point, or jab, or punch. It was almost like, okay, I gotta keep encouraging him. I gotta keep encouraging him. Even when he's doing well, I gotta keep encouraging him, because he needs that, that reinforcement. That was the thing I learned about Luc. And once I learned that, then I understood how our relationship was gonna be established. And, a hug is probably more than a yell. A pat on the back is probably more than a punch, that type of thing. And, once I was able to understand that as a leader, then we can always have a certain dialogue. Okay, mate, I can go back and forth with you, but also I know how to get you to this point that we need you to be consistent. Phil was good at it. I learned it from Phil. Phil understood that with Dennis, he understood that with me, he understood that with Scotty, Tony, Steve, all of it. And that was the strong points about who Phil Jackson was. I had to learn that through him, and then when I got back, obviously, I had different personalities that I hadn't been with, so I had to understand who these people were so that I could have a relationship, the Steve Kerr and the Punch, and, Tony Kukoc from the 92, Dream Team, blah, blah, blah. Once we understood how those dynamics would work, the communication aspect was much simpler.
So you obviously taught Luc a lot. Did Luc teach you anything? You kind of intimated
Yes.
a little bit then that you realized that you had to kind of meet the person where they were at. Was there anything else that Luc taught you?
No, I think, his calm demeanor and his acceptance for all different types of people is an unbelievable trait, and I was able to learn and watch and analyze how he built his relationship to, coexist in his personalities and his friends and things of that nature that, okay, I could take bits and pieces of that. Now, could I change my personality? I can't. But at least I can have a better understanding for how other people are thinking, so it can alter my thought process and how I would adapt to certain people. So yeah, I learned things from Luc. I learned things from other players. But my personality was always going to be dominant no matter what. But at least it was a consideration to understand and appreciate who I'm playing with and what gets them to tick and how do you relate and have a relationship with them. I mean, those are things that I had to make adjustments to.
So you won 2 three-peats, which is just beyond incredible. How hard was that second three-peat for you? Sort of just summarising all of that up for me.
Well, it was harder than the first three-peat, mainly because I think, anytime you continually repeat things, it's harder from a mentality standpoint to create that hunger, as if you never won or you're just winning for the first time. The first three-peat was a team that was together for a long period of time, pretty much 8-9 years, we were together. Second three-peat was a patchwork. We got players from different places, and I wasn't there most of the time when they got there. The first time I was there, I was the existing parts from the previous year. And then we just kept plugging it in, and everybody, saw the mentality, everybody adjusted to the mentality. Well, the second three-peat was I brought my mentality to a team that was already existing. So now I had to apply that, and it was much more difficult to do that, in the second three-peat than the first. And not that it, obviously it worked, but it put a lot of, mental and physically, straining, situations, with teammates, and understanding, the mentality that it took to win. And we got there, and we appreciated. And, the 96 was probably the toughest one because I was coming from, a defeat in 95 where I played baseball. Everyone thought I was a step slower. So I had to prove myself, and my father, the first time I actually done it without my father. So, I mean, all these emotions and all these different things are coming at me. And, to me, that was the most difficult if I had to pick of the 6. And then once we were able to understand, okay, this is Michael Jordan, he's going to be aggressive. This is Luc, he's going to be somewhat passive, but you got to pull him along. Steve Kerr, you got to get him encouraged. Dennis, you got to pull him in every now and then. He's going to be Dennis. Scotty's going to be Scotty. Once we understood how the players were on that team, it clicked. No wonder we won 72 games, the following year. And then, we was able to maintain, what we did pretty much in the second three-peat, but it took a process, so it was much harder.
Thank you. Now, look, The Last Dance was absolutely huge in Australia. Everyone loved it. But Australian viewers also wondered why Luc wasn't involved and why Luc wasn't interviewed. What's your take on that, Michael?
You can say that a lot, and the thing is that I had no control in terms of who you were going to interview. There was a lot of guys that said the same thing, and Jason could answer it much better than I, because it was more of their control, And once again, he was and is, an integral part to this whole process. And I think that, if you look back and say, well, we should have included Luc, we should have included, other players that were significant to the team, and it's hard, but. I had no control over that, and it's unfortunate, and I can understand why Australia would say, well, why wouldn't we include Luc? And we probably should have. And that was, I guess, if you look back and say if I could change anything, that's probably what I could have changed, where you would want to interview every single body and get a perspective from a lot of different angles.
Now, your desire to win and your toughness on the team as a result of that is absolutely legendary and was explored in The Last Dance. Luc described your leadership style as carnivorous. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I can see that from his perspective. Quite naturally, yes, I can see that. And look, I didn't go in there with that mentality. That's how it's gonna. It's just so my mentality was to win at all costs, and pull, push, yank, whatever to get everybody on the same page. And I understand it. And the thing is that if I were to change my personality back, to something totally different, I wouldn't be who I would have been. I don't think we would have had the same successes. I think a lot of players probably wouldn't have been the same in terms of their perspective. So yeah, I can see him saying that. But the thing is that I think it was needed in some respect, and I think our success illustrates that.
One of the themes of this story in Luc's life, it's sort of charting Luc's life, is the fact that he did have to change. He was a gentle giant. He got to the NBA, he had to kind of put on the armour and toughen up. And then he found once his NBA career was over, he found it very difficult to shed that sort of tough armour that he'd had to sort of gird himself with. And that he quite struggled with that for quite a long time. Can you relate to that?
110%. Part of my struggles after the game is my competitive drive. I was such a competitive player, and each and every day felt the need to always get ahead of my opponent. Well, when you're out of sports and you're in in normal life, you don't shed that armor that you actually have coated yourself with, based on your lifestyle and that work ethic. It's just, you have to find your way around it, and that's frustrating, and sometimes that's even tough, because of the competitive nature that I have. I look at everything from a competitive nature, and I tell my wife all the time is that I'm cursed. I'm cursed from a competitive standpoint that, I cannot watch or compete or be a part of things without competition, and that's something that I live with today, but I would not want to live without, because I think it says so much about me and helped me define who I really want or was or am, and attain all the things I really wanted. Now it's the challenge is to calm those nerves. That's why I do a lot more fishing now. I would have never thought I would get on a boat and go fishing. But the competition of patience and being, trying to catch a fish, trying to be patient, it's not going to happen. You can't make it happen. You just have to be ready when it does happen. Those are all things that I think calms me down a lot more than if I'm playing a sport, if I'm playing golf or if I'm doing anything competitive. Because I think that, that's what I need. That's the therapy that I need to help soothe some of this competitive juices that I have.
Well, that's interesting because Luc loves fishing too, loves boats and fishings. When you look back on those years, was it sad to say goodbye to your teammates like Luc once the sort of Chicago Bulls and that team were no more?
Yes, and it's still sad. I mean, look, Luc emails me all the time, and every time I see it, good day, mate, it brings a smile to my face in the sense that, we don't spend the type of time we used to. Even though, if you ask him or you ask me, I think it was genuine time, even though we were competing and we were learning about each other and we were pushing each other, blah, blah, blah. Those are still genuine times, and you don't share those with too many people. So yeah, I miss spending time with him. I miss seeing, that face that's never going to be sad no matter what happens. He's just funny. I think the thing that was in amazement of every time I spin and see Luc, it was a shock to see someone, he was looking at me and I could feel this coming from him, is that how can one person be so competitive each and every day and blah, 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 and yet he doesn't seem like he's enjoying life. When actually I was enjoying the competition. That was my enjoyment. I sensed that sometimes when he used to look at me, and just kind of, and I didn't take it negatively. I took it as a badge of honor. I take my job seriously. I take my competitive nature very seriously. But sometimes looking at him and seeing and joking and, we sense of humor and, it's fun, and you miss that. You miss that celebration of starting a goal at the beginning of the year, and then at the end of the year, the gratification that we went through hell to get here, but we got here, and let's just enjoy it. Let's have fun, and let's do it again in another 3 months. That was the mentality. You missed that in '98.
And you're a busy man, Michael. Why did you agree to take time out of your schedule for Luc to do this interview for Luc?
He matters to me. He does matter to me, and his story needs to be told. And I'm pretty sure I can enlighten it from my perspective, and and give people his meaningfulness to me. As a teammate, as a competitor. Sure, I mean, there's some good and there's some bad, but that's all a part of life. You're gonna have friends that you have good and bad things about. But we went through the trenches. We shared a lot. We competed together, and I would take him any day of the week if I had to go through a competition again. If you asked me to do it all over again, there's no way I would leave Luc Longley off my team. No way possible, because he mattered. He had an impact on me. He helped me change as a person. So I mean, to hear that they're recognizing him, and you would think, most people think, what can they be saying about Luc in a documentary? You can be saying a lot about the guy, and I am a example of what he meant to me and how he made me better as a player, as a person, and that story needs to be told about a person that people think it's very minor, but they're not. They're very major when it comes to winning a championship. Those people do matter.
Well, that's lovely. And at the end of the day, Luc credits you with compensating for his weaknesses with your brilliance and dragging him across the line 3 times. So thank you very much for that.
No problem. It was my pleasure. And once again, they are motivating to me. They were, for me to ultimately get them where they needed to go, and ultimately we got where we needed to go. I mean, it was teamwork. It wasn't a one band. It was teamwork. They made me better as well.